Welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. As you all know, I do also have an extra series that is following all the important women thinkers in the history of philosophy and the sciences. Today, I'm extremely excited to have Dr. Ruth Edith Hagengruber here to speak about Émilie du Châtelet. Dr. Hagengruber is a German philosopher and professor of philosophy at the University of Paderborn. She specializes in the history of women philosophers, focusing on the mathematician, physicist, and philosopher Émilie du Châtelet. Dr. Hagengruber's research is dedicated to revision of the patriarchal history, especially to the rediscovery of women's alternative contributions to the history of philosophy and the history of economics, with a focus on circular and universality-based economics as an approach to an integrative economic ethics. She is published on value theory in feminist economics and reflects on the technical design from a feminist and inclusive point of view, such as autonomous driving, a different approach to labor, and a profound recognition of creative skills. She specializes in the history of women philosophers. Dr. Hagengruber is the founder and director of the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists, and founder of the research area Ecotech Gender. Now, I will also in the video, the write-up for the video, put in all the links. You need to see the center that Dr. Hagengruber has put together, the discussions, the publications. It's just fantastic. She is the editor of the German series Frauen und Philosophie und Wissenschaft since 2014, and as co-editor of the international Springer series Women in the History of Philosophy and Science since 2018. And for the center, she conceptualized the first digital and encyclopedia of concise concepts by women philosophers. Dr. Hagengruber has founded and co-edits the Journal for the History of Women Philosophers at Brill and also with De Groote Publishing, and she edits the series Women Philosophers and World Heritage Collection. She became a life member of the International Association of Philosophy of Information Science in 2011, congratulations, and is elected member of the Leibniz Societät der Wissenschaften zu Berlin in 2020, and since 2021, she serves as the secretary of the International Association of Women Philosophers. So, thank you so much and welcome to the Young Idealist series. It's so amazing to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be in your series.
The first time I ever saw you speak was you were talking to, it was for the center actually. You were speaking to Antonio Calgano on Edith Stein, and the video and the discussion made me fall in love with Edith Stein, and I started reading more and looking at more of the literature that was coming out of the center and fell in love with all of these fantastic women phenomenologists. So I cannot thank you enough for putting together all of these wonderful discussions and information.
This was a crucial point in the development of the history of women philosophers, bringing in the women from phenomenology, because for a long time, it was thought there are only, let's say, women in philosophy in the early modern period.
Let's begin with a kind of introductory question. Who was Émilie du Châtelet, and why does her philosophy matter for today's contemporary world? And maybe also a little bonus question here too. What brought you to her thought?
I will start with answering the last question. What did bring me to her? Because this is, you said that your series was dedicated or is dedicated to the Kantian and German tradition. And if someone is important, and if there is a figure you have not yet known that made Kant to what Kant is, it is Émilie du Châtelet. So, and I will explain that in our little discussion here. So when I started to study philosophy, and of course in Germany you did Kant, so I realized that Kant had written his first dissertation mentioning the name of du Châtelet 17 times. Then the most harsh opposer to Kantian thought, or let's say, I don't know, he didn't oppose Kantian thought, but he said, Kant, your thoughts are not new, but there are some people who have already said what you are saying. He mentioned du Châtelet. And this is 40 years after she was dead. You have to understand that in Germany, du Châtelet's opus magnum, the institutions, I call it the institutions, not the foundations. In English, it's often mentioned as foundations, which is not a good and not a true translation, that these institutions were a crucial text for the German Enlightenment, and it was listed on the 100 books you must have read in the 18th century. So you imagine. And this is how I came. And then I realized, because Eberhard, when he attacks Kant, Eberhard is quoting from the French edition. So when I found out that there was a German translation made immediately, let's say in 1 year later than the extended edition that she had launched, then I started to understand that this is a book which is incredibly important for the German Enlightenment and especially for Kant. So why she's relevant today, this was the start of your question. Why does her philosophy matter today? So beside the fact that there is Euler, Maupertuis, and she's a key source also for, let's say, some secondary, if I'm allowed to say so, Baumgarten, Meyer, Kästner, Formé, and so on. So it is the new idea of science that she developed, and I will present to you, which is of outstanding importance till today. And thirdly, of course, it is because her example allows us to understand how corrupt and wrong the history is when it's only told by male voices.
Thank you so much for that really rich answer. And I agree with you, which is why we're having this discussion on her thought. Now you have me excited about hearing more about this wonderful philosopher. So, could you possibly give us a short biography about Émilie du Châtelet's life? Now, it doesn't have to be too exhaustive. You can go as far in depth as you like, or as little as possible. It's up to you.
Okay, so I will respond in three parts, let's say. First, I give you the dates, I say something about her education, and then I have to add something on her works, because many people think, and it was said, that women didn't publish a lot. She was a successful publisher, like many other women. Émilie du Châtelet was born in 1706 into a very high aristocratic family. Her name is Gabrielle Émilie Le Tonnelier de Breteuil. And then at 19, she married the colonel and military man from even a more old and older family, Le Chatelet, Florent Claude Marquis de Chatelet-Lomont. She died in 1749. There is an important period in her time. In 1735, she moves away from Paris to Cirey, which is a small castle which belongs to the family of du Châtelet. But within that time, she lives there more or less, and more or less with Voltaire. She spends a lot of time in Brussels. And this is also important because in Brussels, she leads the family affairs, the jurisprudential affairs for the du Châtelet family. This is important to understand. In 1746, she became member of the Academy of Bologna, and she became also member of the Accademia dell'Arcadia di Rome. So she was a famous woman. There is a lot of writing about her in Germany in that time, a lot of praise. She was well known. So what do we know about her education? We know that she had a diary which she called herself Emiliana. And we know that this diary exists even shortly before her death. But we do not know now where it is. So Voltaire is under suspicion. So this is a big problem. All we know about her education is from Voltaire. He wrote a lot about her, also praising her a lot. He said that she knew Latin. We are not so sure she knew Greece, most probably, because he compares her all the time to Madame Dacier. We know that she knew Virgil, Lucretius, Cicero, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Archimede. She excelled in physics, mathematics. She had the most famous teachers in mathematics. She was dedicated to poetry, and she even sang the very innovative music from Issei. She performed herself as a vocalist. And then she was said that she multiplied without problems 9 figures by 9 in her head. She went, to the most famous coffee shops in Paris in men's clothing to have the debates with the men there. So she was an extraordinary woman, and she was famous as being extraordinary. Then I have also to introduce to those who are willing to listen here and to say some words what she has written. Because there is always said that these women did not write, but she was a very successful writer. So what did she write? Let me divide her opus in 4 parts. We have one part which is now in St. Petersburg, and among the manuscripts of Voltaire, which went to St. Petersburg and Russia. These are the very early writings, and some of them she did with Voltaire together. So this is very interesting, of course, because we see how she distances from him. At least she attacks him, John Locke, and so on, all his friends, big friends. So, and in these writings, she already sketches out a system of philosophical investigation into physics, chemistry, optics, mathematics, metaphysics, ontology, grammar, morals, feminist ideas, Bible critics. So then we have, let's say, a second phase, which starts already in 1737, because in 37, she submits her first own work to the French Academy of Science, which will be published also with the Academy of Science together with the prize winner. She is not a prize winner, it's a dissertation on fire, which is a very important work. Then in 1738 already, her opus magnum was meant to be published and had the allowance of the censor. And even in 38, it was said it is an excellent work describing the ideas of Leibniz and Newton. But then she withdrew, and she worked on these institutions another 2 years. We have the manuscript of this redrafting. And we did here in Paderborn the versions of this manuscript. So it's really exciting, because in the second edition, she went back to the manuscript and took a lot out from the manuscript, which she included then in the second edition of 1742, which is a much extended version of the institution. So then we have the third part, which is dedicated to Newton. It is not only that she translated Newton, it is that she transcribed his mathematics into the Leibnizian calculus. And she, of course, gave the first French translation, which was the translation that allowed then Lagrange and Laplace to write their own physics, and which was the model even for Cohen in the 20th century for his translation. So because it was more than a translation that she has given. And then we have the fourth part of her publications, which is defined by her moral writings, her examination on the Bible, and so on. These works all only survived as manuscripts. But we know we have several parts of the manuscript, and we know that these manuscripts were read.
What a brilliant philosopher, and so much dialogue, such a rich life that she lived. And I'm glad we're doing this episode that we can get, her life, her philosophy, and her understanding out there to more people interested in the ideas of philosophers. So I'm so happy that we're doing this. So, who are Émilie du Châtelet's main philosophical and scientific influences, and how does she apply or perhaps respond to these influences in her work?
So, of course, this is a crucial question. This is one of the most important questions. And I first respond with the three key names, which are Descartes, Newton, and Leibniz. All the three are depicted in a medallion in the first edition. She's going to them, praying to them. But in the end, she's overcoming them. And this is the challenge, and I will try to sketch that out shortly. So let's start to make the division between there is a relation Descartes-Newton, and then there is the debate between Leibniz and Newton. And both debates have been changed and reshaped by her. When she entered the scene, what was the situation? The situation in France was, as her friend Voltaire said, there are the dreamers, the continentals, and there are the men of reason, the islanders. It's really funny because the islanders still speak of themselves like that till today. However, this is a French invention, so this is what Voltaire said to offend the French people a bit. And she said, no, this is not like that, but I will tell you how she can. So first we have to understand why Descartes and Newton have been opposed so much in that time, and why did we understand that? So from a methodological point of view, it is that Descartes, as a skeptic, said we don't know anything. Everything is hypothetical. And so Descartes said, let me find this one Archimedes point, which is the one and only truth from where I can deduce all other knowledge and principles. So this is, on the one hand, it is the full hypothetical and hypotheticized skepticism. And on the other hand, it is a principalism that follows the Euclidean model of deduction. So Newton is the contrary. Newton said, hypothesis non fingo. I don't do hypothesis. I observe the universe. And then I apply the divine mathematics to show you what is the truth. These are the two ideas behind. So how can you resolve that? She resolved that in her theory of hypothesis. There is one thing that is the same in Descartes and Newton, and this is how they apply force. Newton and Descartes both understand the movements in the world via what we call today the impulse, which is measuring the forces, the movements in the world by mass, by velocity. But the problem is, and this is a core problem that both of them have, Descartes and Newton, they have to make God and remain still Aristotelian because God has to move the vortices in Descartes' plenum, and God has to give the first movement to the planetarian universe in Newton. And this is a point that Du Châtelet does not accept. She says that is no science because you can hold everything God has done, then we do not need science if we go. And then so she faces a problem by that because if it is not God who brings the force to the world, who brings the force to the world and how does, and what is it when we move ourselves, she's asking. So do we add force to the sum of energy in the world? How can that be? So this becomes one of the main problems for her. And she is going to solve that problem in her idea. She invents the dynamics. It's not. She also influences Euler a lot. And she is remembered when Einstein was celebrated because she went so far in her idea now of how we can understand that there is one energy in the world and that all movements, are different versions of this one kind of energy. But there's this second point between or in the controversy between Leibniz and Newton. And this is the famous Leibniz-Clark correspondence. This Leibniz-Clark correspondence is crucial to understand the development of Du Châtelet, also in defeating other ideas and so on. So, but here let me speak about one issue between this Leibniz-Clark correspondence. For those who do not know, behind Clark, there is Newton. Newton was too big to respond to Leibniz because he even held that Leibniz, who published first his infinitesimal calculus. These are all stories aside, but these are the stories and the narratives of the time. There was, you had to be pro-Newton. If you were shaped like today, you were pro-Newton, And then Du Châtelet comes and says, who is this strange German fellow Leibniz? And she started to look into that. And she said, okay, so firstly, the main controversy from Leibniz against Newton is his idea of space. Because what must the assumption that is at the beginning, before Newton can start to calculate his universe, is that he assumes that there is a kind of container, and this container space is somehow created, or God himself, and God put these planets into this container. And then the planets started to move as God gave the first movement to them. And then from time to time had to help. So why do you think that's crazy? Why can't that be? Firstly, we heard that Du Châtelet said, so this is no science when you go back to God, because, either you have a scientific explanation that you can understand by your own rationality or not. And secondly, let's think about if God, and this is the argument from Leibniz, that God could have put the planets wherever he wanted, and at the time he wanted to be. So if it was, as Newton says, it doesn't make sense. So that something happens now and something else is following from that, So all our ideas of cause and effect and all that doesn't make sense in that, because it could happen everywhere. It must not be here. It could also be there. and so on. So all these relations between the things we only understand when we understand that we create, let's say, the places in the world and the locations in relation to each other. So there is what Leibniz is saying, there must always be a sufficient reason why this is here and not there, because something else is here and not there, because something else was before and something came after that. Du Châtelet is following this idea, but how is she solving the problem? And this is also what she said. In this, and now again, you see, she is a big precursor of Kant also, because she says, okay, here we have the relative time and relative space, and here we have the claim for absolute space and time. And she is going to solve that she says, we have the notion of time and space in us. We are the creators of space and time, but this, our creation of space and time, and if you want to read that, I have written so much about that, of course. So we are these creators, and this is the basic that we can get an objective time and space. She says about time, because the feeling how long a moment is, although we can measure this moment and can measure the time when the sun is going around the sun, but the endurance, how you feel it, how long that is always subjective. She has this new idea about force, and she's taking the Leibnizian idea of the living force really to another level. And in her opus Magnum, she then, she presents an idea of Newtonian philosophy within this new idea of a movement that can be explained by itself and not by God.
Your answers are so rich and animated, and they're so interesting, and she just sounds like so wonderful. And I can see the passion in your eyes when you speak about her, so I can tell um, this is a thinker that really means quite a lot to you. Why was Du Châtelet's theory of hypothesis and the teaching of hypothesis so important for the natural sciences? And what was her own contribution to the Enlightenment?
So her theory of hypothesis, and this is also the importance, and this is her very contribution to the history of philosophy and the history of ideas, to the Enlightenment, is her theory of hypothesis, and what is included there is a completely new scientific method, or a completely new method of scientific inquiry, of verification and justification of scientific findings. You must think how Descartes tried to ensure truth. Think of how Newton tried to do that. So either by observation, by experience, or by tracing back to the first causes. And exactly this is the first phrase in Du Châtelet's chapter on a hypothesis. She said, you will never arrive at the first cause. So give it up. If you want to do science, just leave that. And then the next is, what does it mean that you start with the observation, what you see? So now comes the crucial example. So she says, and here she is creating a topos in the history of science that is used till Feyerabend and Kuhn and Quine. This is now, she creates this idea of the Copernican turn. She says, okay, let's compare. Who is right, Ptolemaios or Copernicus? The one who delivered an explanation of the universe based on the heliocenter and the other on the geocenter, or the other way around. And how do you secure who was right of them? What is the point? This is the question. You find it in Kuhn till firearm. It didn't change. This is also, you see the power that she has and the long-standing influence and impact. Copernicus and Ptolemy both observed the same sky, both saw the same things. So, and both made hypotheses. It is not that the one is now true and the other is false. It is that we have hypotheses, one which we find today truth-like, and the other one no longer truth-like. So there might be applications, she's really daring in her book. She said there might be applications where the Ptolemaic is more suitable than the Copernican. And she's absolutely right from a present point of view, saying that. So, okay, what makes Copernicus more convincing? This is the question. And it is because our system of hypothesis, which is like a texture, like a tissue of hypothesis, like a web of hypothesis, is stronger. And now something comes in, what she has refuted first. There was a divide between the empiricists and the rationalists. And she said, now both are instrumental to verify the hypothesis. It's not only one, but they are instrumental to verify. I have to see if these hypotheses are made according to principles, because you can't contradict yourself. Then you don't establish any kind of science. And you have to verify your hypothesis in experience, because if the results are different, then it is nonsense. And then she has 12 rules. She invents 12 rules also of fallibilism. Does the whole hypothesis fail when you find one mistake or a branch and so on? This is a very elaborated system of procedure. And so you can understand how science was put now on a completely new floor of understanding. Now we have an epistemology, what is used to be seen as an epistemology. There's no longer a God within that realm of explanation. In the verification of the propositions, you have these hypotheses and you have a logical procedure how to build up truth-like knowledge. And you understand that these truth-like knowledge is different to what the realists before and the idealists said. But there is still a second insight. It's not only, that we are doing hypotheses since the Chatelet, and you have to understand also, there is not that she was forgotten. Even this is a very bad interpretation of women, that all these women were vanished and no one knew them. No, they were read. Maupertuis read a lot of them. She was read in her time by Kant, as I said, and so on. But she was also then by Condillac, who wrote on hypothesis and took her hypothesis. Her chapter on hypothesis was reprinted in the Encyclopédie. It was reprinted with Formet. It was reprinted in the 19th century. So it was well known. She is mentioned by Bachelard, by Poincaré, but Popper doesn't mention her. But Popper mentions Maupertuis, and Maupertuis was one of the closest allies in her thing. So, I think I have some suspicion on Popper that he simply, like on Kant, that danger is, okay, a woman we do not side. So, but I wanted to talk also about a second insight in this hypothesis, that she presented the idea of science in a completely new way, saying that science is hypothetical. But in saying so, she also established a second truth with that, and that now that science is not picturing the world. It's not you know that. What we understand in science is an expanded reality. It is not the reality as we see that. And I like to illustrate that with a wonderful example that she gives, and she describes the rings of Saturn that have been invented, she says, by Huygens, because Huygens only sees the light spots. And then he says these are rings, but there are no rings, there are only light spots. But his hypothesis of rings is so good that it holds for all the accountings that you and all the other hypotheses that you make. So you see that this kind of science is now going far beyond what you think that science is or what you see. So the great innovations that she is achieving at this, she's expanding science that creates its own objects. And you are back now to the Copernican turn. We make the world, invent the world according to our abilities, as it is then written and praised, Kant praised for. Then, of course, she is the forerunner, and she is the one who creates this idea of the Copernican turn and explains it in its scientific history. And of course, her procedure of hypothetical reasoning is the procedure of science till today. So what?
I feel almost embarrassed because I knew none of that actually. And I'm being honest with you. So, and as someone that studies this tradition in German, like the German tradition, I had no idea that any of that, of her creating the Copernican turn, or that Poincaré read her, that Bachelard read her, and both of those are they're very well read, very important thinkers. Wow, unbelievable, fantastic. On March 30th of this year, a new German edition, edited and introduced by yourself, of Du Châtelet's Naturlehre, will be published and available from De Gruyter Publishing. This text is, of course, Du Châtelet's 1743 magnum opus, The Institutions, Physiques, that both Euler, Wolff, and Kant found extremely profound. So what makes this text so important, and what Du Châtelet accomplishes in this work? This may be a really big question, so I apologize if it's super big.
Yeah, but some of that I have already responded to with the theory of hypothesis and of sciences, so I will not start from anew. But I think it's really important to understand why she became so important in Germany. And I think she was very important in France too. But, I'm in Germany, and as I said at the beginning, when I read Kant and I found all these signs, his dissertation that quotes her 17 times, and in fact, it is a dissertation on her idea of the living forces, on this new idea of forces. And then she came back later on with the Eberhard discussion. So let's go back to this first living forces discussion. So Du Châtelet, as I have said, in her opus magnum, The Institutions, Du Châtelet presented the Newtonian physics already, it has often been said, in a Leibnizian clothing. But this is not enough to say. It is because Leibniz never reformulated Newton in his own metaphysics. But she did it now, and she explained Newton, who was dependent on this God, God mover, and on this absolute space. She now presented a physics that went towards dynamics, that understood that the things must relate to each other. So she gave it a different framing. And as this idea of the living forces was an attack that was launched primarily by Leibniz against Descartes. And as Du Châtelet was immediately attacked by the Newtonians, and by none less than the secretary of the French Academy, I said, oh, what can you do, crazy Chatelet? Although her first book was published anonymously, you see that she was well known. So she was attacked. And then there developed a short correspondence between the two, now called the dispute between Du Châtelet and Marat. And this dispute on the living forces, on this question on God and the forces, was immediately translated by another outstanding German now woman, because this time was rich in outstanding women, Louise Gottsched. Within 4 months, she had translated that in excellent, funny German, and it made Louise Gottsched very successful, and it made Du Châtelet in Germany very successful. And there's an incredibly intelligent introduction by Louise Gottsched, about which I could talk also for hours because it's really important. Also, it was so important for the becoming of Du Châtelet in Germany, because immediately after, and first Gottsched so Louise Gottsched thought to translate also the opus magnum, the institutions. But she did not do that. And these are strange things that we do not really understand. But nonetheless, the institutions have then immediately been translated into not only into German, but also into Italian. Not to think only she was a big figure in France and in Germany, but also in Italy, in Greece, post-college, the creation, so many people wrote about her. So, yeah, her opus magnum was translated into German, and you see, and then it was on the list of the most important 100 writings in Germany till the end of the 18th century. So this was a name. And when you think that Eberhard quoted her 40 years after her death in 1789, and using a reference to Du Châtelet to reject Kant's claim for originality is just a thing. So because there's 40 years, think now that a book is quoted from 40 years earlier. And then of a woman, in this male patriarch society. I would like to point to another issue, because Kant is also always praised as a big Enlightenment thinker. But it is she who is saying that. German philosophy, Leibniz, was not really at stake at that time, because the big Newton has already shown that this Leibniz was only a follower of him, and, there was this struggle with the infinitesimal and so on. So, and in her avant-propos, she says, when you want to do science, you should not have any prejudice. It is not important if someone is a German, an English, or a French. You should go and follow reason. And when you follow reason, you should not idolatrize. You should not take the big names for speaking truth in every part. And there's this wonderful quote where she says, there are the greatest absurdities in Aristotle and Newton next the most wonderful ideas. So, you always have to employ your own reason if you want to understand something. And this made her, let's say, to overcome the divide between the rationalists and the empiricists, something for which Kant is praised. She did that with her theory of hypothesis. She said both are instrumental for hypothesis, but the first is that we get to scientific ideas and these ideas in a different way. Secondly, she presents this new idea of how we find ourselves into the world via our notion, the subjective notion of space and time, and build upon this subjective notion of space and time, the objective, or as she calls that, not objective, she doesn't call it objective, she calls it the ideal notion of time and space. And she tells you how you deduce that, the one from the other, you know. And she also, these are wonderful things when she explains how you invent the idea of eternity like that. So read it. I'm convinced that Wolf was not very important for her. Of course, we have relations to Wolf in her writings, but it is not crucial. Crucial is Leibniz for her, and even the Wolfians of that time complained about the fact that they are not mentioned. Wolf is not mentioned, always Leibniz, Leibniz, Leibniz. Only in the first edition she mentions Wolf. And she says Wolf is a great Bavard, you know, a chatterer, a great chatterer. He didn't invent anything new and so on, while she is full of and really brings and develops Leibniz further, much beyond. You must understand that there was not much known from Leibniz in that time. And when you read her, you sometimes think that you read some works of Leibniz that have only been published after her death, you know, so, okay. But the point with Wolf is that Wolf's German metaphysics was translated into the French on order of the later Prussian King Frederick and was sent to Voltaire and to Chatelet. And therefore, there has been a research for a certain time who thought this made her change her book, but and other claims from of plagiarism from a German and so on. But even Wolf did not claim to that fact, you know. So I think it's quite senseless, and yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for all of this rich information about de Châtelet. In thinking about Châtelet's legacy in the history of philosophy, what do you want your readers of your work and from the center to remember about Châtelet's contributions to philosophy and the sciences?
So I think it is necessary to understand how she created this idea of the Copernican turn and how she explained the history of science. She developed a whole architecture about how the history of science is developing. What she said about time and space, and, you know, that one has to read her as a link between Leibniz and Kant. This is necessary. But as a philosopher in her own right, I think what one has to understand and to learn is her theory, her concept of the expanding science. This is her defining achievement, you know. And her great contribution to philosophy is this innovative theory of knowledge. She invents what we then see with Kant, an epistemology. You know, it is all relying on what we can know, on our understanding and the limits of our understanding, because she's clearly talking about the limits of our understanding. So, but she was innovative in her understanding of the dynamic forces in the universe. And in that respect, she was much ahead of her time. As I have already mentioned, she was remembered then in the great Einstein, 100 years Einstein theory of relativity. So her legacy in Kant, Euler, Maupertuis, and so on put her in the first row of philosophers. And for me, all these magnificent insights that emerge from her writings are reason enough to engage with her work. Last but not least, I think we gain a new perspective. Reading her, we start to understand, because I was clear, when I started to do philosophy, there are many women philosophers, and I do not understand why so many women are also ignorant of this huge tradition. Of course, men should also not be ignorant and think of Plato. Plato was the first philosopher said, but he says he has his philosophy taken from women philosophers. Socrates, so, and he says we must have philosophy out of women and of the philosophy of women and men. So it is necessarily, for the sake of our cultures, of our science, it is necessary to restore this great tradition and then to overcome the corruptions that are included in our traditions. And she's, of course, she's one of the really big figures, because also the history of women philosophers has big figures and minor figures, as every history, and she is surely a big fish.
Dr. Hagengruber, I just want to thank you so much for coming here and sharing all of your ideas on this wonderful thinker, Émilie du Châtelet, and for guiding us and the viewers through her work, her philosophy, and her importance to this tradition. So I can't thank you enough.
It was a pleasure, and thank you for having me.